Welcome to the Political Science Data Podcast. I'm Ryan, your host. This podcast helps you keep up to date with political science data and research. I am joined by my co-host, Emma.
Hello, Ryan. It's a pleasure to join you on this podcast. Today we're discussing recent research about the discipline of political science.
So political scientists are turning analytic tools on themselves?
That's right. I'm sure the works we highlight will give listeners a lot to think about. There's a lot they can take away from this episode. Ryan, are you ready to get started?
Yes, indeed. Let's get cracking. We'll start with geographical coverage in political science research. This article was authored by Matthew Wilson and Henrik Knutsen. It was published by Cambridge in Perspectives on Politics. Emma, let's start with the big picture. What central question are the authors asking in this article?
The article asks a straightforward but important question. How geographically balanced is political science research? The authors want to know which countries and regions scholars have actually studied, and whether our discipline has become more globally inclusive or remains dominated by a few Western cases.
That's really clear. How did they go about answering it? What's the research design and the data they used?
They built a new dataset covering more than 27,000 publications in 8 of the top political science journals, stretching from 1906 to 2019. They searched titles and abstracts for country and region references, then analyzed patterns across time, across subfields like comparative politics and international relations, and across individual countries. They also linked those patterns to factors like GDP, democracy levels, population size, and language.
So what did they actually find? What stands out in the results?
The main takeaway is that political science has historically been dominated by studies of North America and Western Europe, and the US in particular. There has been some globalization in recent decades, more attention to Latin America, Africa, and parts of Asia, but the bias toward richer, more democratic and English or European language countries remains very strong. In international relations especially, the US and Western Europe still dominate far more than other regions.
Given all that, what should political scientists take away from this? How does it matter for the profession?
The practical advice is that we need to be conscious of these biases when we design and evaluate research. For faculty and department leaders, that means encouraging projects that extend beyond the familiar Western cases, and recognizing that our theories may be narrower than we think if they're built mainly on US and European data. For individual scholars, the message is to push the boundaries of case selection to improve both the inclusiveness and the generalizability of our field.
Our next article is titled Pre-Analysis Plans and Early Stocktaking. This article was authored by George K. Ofosu and Daniel N. Posner. It was published by Cambridge in Perspective on Politics in 2023. Emma, let's dive in. What's the main question this article is trying to answer?
The authors ask, what have we learned so far about pre-analysis plans in political science? They're taking stock of how scholars are using them, what benefits they provide, and what challenges remain.
And how does this fit into broader debates in the field?
It's part of the larger transparency and replication movement in political science. The idea is that by specifying hypotheses and analysis strategies in advance, scholars can reduce bias and improve credibility.
So what kind of data and evidence do the authors use to make their assessment?
They conducted an early review of pre-analysis plans submitted to the AEA's Registry of Randomized Controlled Trials, looking at over 200 plans filed by political scientists. They examined how detailed these plans were, what kinds of information they included, and how researchers actually used them in published work.
And what did they find when they looked at those plans?
They found that pre-analysis plans are spreading quickly, but many are incomplete or vague. Some don't specify hypotheses clearly, or they leave open a lot of room for researcher discretion. Still, the authors argue that even imperfect plans can help curb selective reporting and improve transparency, especially if combined with good practices like data sharing.
So what's the key lesson here for political scientists and department leaders?
The takeaway is that the discipline should encourage the use of pre-analysis plans in experimental and survey research, but also train scholars on how to write them well. For individual faculty, the advice is to treat pre-analysis as a tool for credibility, not just a formality. Doing so can strengthen both the integrity of our findings and the reputation of the field.
I would like to remind listeners that Political Science Data features all the articles discussed on this podcast on our website, policydata.com.
The articles in this episode are featured in the Teaching and Learning subfield. You can find links to full texts and replication materials online.
The next article we've selected is Reviewing and the State of the Discipline. It was authored by Paul A. Djupe and Brooklyn Evann Walker. The article was published by Cambridge in PS, Political Science and Politics in 2025. Emma, to get us started, what central question are the authors trying to answer in this piece?
Thanks, Ryan. At its core, this article asks whether peer reviewing in political science has changed over the past decade, especially after the pandemic. The authors want to know who is doing reviews, how many they are completing, and whether the system is under strain.
Okay, so how did they actually go about studying that? What sort of data are they working with?
The analysis is based on surveys of political scientists conducted in 2013 and again in 2024. Both surveys asked about the number of review requests, how often scholars accepted them, and their attitudes toward peer review. They also gathered demographic and career information to see how reviewing patterns differ by rank, institution type, and other characteristics.
And what did they discover? Has reviewing really changed that much?
The big finding is that reviewing has declined among those who historically did the most, full professors at PhD granting institutions. At the same time, reviewing has spread more broadly across the discipline, with assistant and associate professors picking up a larger share. That's partly because editors are intentionally diversifying the reviewer pool, and partly because peer reviewing has become more institutionalized, less a mark of prestige and more a basic service expectation.
That's interesting. So what's the takeaway for political scientists and especially department leaders?
The practical lesson is that departments and the discipline should recognize reviewing as core professional service and train junior scholars to see it that way. Faculty leaders need to reinforce norms of reciprocity. If you submit papers, you should be reviewing papers. At the same time, they should be careful not to overload early career scholars with service expectations in the name of diversity. Striking that balance will help sustain peer review without burning out the next generation.
Now then, let's have a look at an article with the inspiring title, Cite the Good Site, Making Citations in Political Science More Transparent. It was authored by Jonathan Grossman and published by Cambridge in PS, Political Science and Politics. Emma, what's the central question this article is tackling?
The author is asking why political science continues to rely so heavily on vague, general citations, and whether the discipline should move toward requiring more precise and transparent citations that point readers directly to the relevant page, section, or figure.
So how does the author go about studying that? What's the research design here?
The study is observational. Grossman analyzed 256 articles published in 5 leading political science and international relations journals during 2019. He manually coded more than 26,000 citations, identifying which were general references, and which included precise location details like page numbers. He also ran regression models to test what factors predicted more detailed citations.
And what did he find? How common are those detailed citations?
The key finding is that only about 10% of all citations across those journals were detailed. In some articles, there weren't any precise citations at all. Grossman shows that factors like article length and the number of citations per word predict more detailed referencing, but the overall norm in the discipline is still overwhelmingly general citation.
That sounds like a transparency issue. What's the practical takeaway here for political scientists?
The message is that our discipline needs to treat citation practices as part of the broader push for transparency. Faculty, reviewers, and journal editors should encourage detailed citations where possible, especially when an argument hinges on a specific claim in another work.
I must say, it's a very large gain for such a small ask. I think I'm on board with this one.
For departments, this is also a reminder to train graduate students to think about citations as evidence, not just a formality, so that readers can really follow and verify their reasoning.
Are you ready for our final segment? We are changing up the format a bit here.
Yes, in this segment, we're looking back at the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on the discipline. We've pulled together 4 studies for this.
Let me start by introducing the articles. We have Through Their Own Eyes, The Implications of COVID-19 for PhD Students by Nicholas Haas, Aida Gureghian, Cristel Jusino Diaz and Abby Williams. Also The Pandemic and Gender Inequality in Academia by Eunji Kim and Shawn Patterson Jr. And Leveling the Field, Gender Inequity in Academia During COVID by Marwa Shalaby, Nermin Allam and Gail J. Buttorff. Finally, The Great Equalizer, Gender, Parenting, and Scholarly Productivity During the Global Pandemic by Marijke Breuning, Christina Fattore, Jennifer Ramos and Jamie Scalera.
This set of articles paints a vivid picture. They show how the pandemic magnified pre-existing gender inequalities, especially around childcare and family responsibilities. They show the career fallout in academia, publication slowdowns, uneven productivity, mental health challenges, and the risk of falling further behind. And we see evidence of structural inequities within institutions themselves.
Let's start with the big theme. The pandemic wasn't the great equalizer that some people first called it.
That's right, it widened inequalities. Female academics, especially those with young children, saw major disruptions in their ability to research and publish, while men were more likely to maintain or even increase productivity.
Let's tease apart the pandemic effects you describe. Based on these studies, it appears that parenting was the big driver. Faculty with young kids at home took the hardest hit when schools and daycares closed, right?
That's exactly right. Parents of young children were affected the most. But even after controlling for parenting status, the pandemic widened inequalities. Women still experience more disruption than men. Junior faculty, contingent faculty, and women of color also experience sharper negative effects, independent of parenting. That points to structural issues in the allocation of support, expectations, and resources.
Was there anything these studies didn't capture that might help explain the remaining gaps?
Yes, they didn't break out single parents versus partnered parents. That's a big missing piece. If single parenting is related to gender, race, or other variables, it could explain away the reported differences.
Emma, looking across these studies, what lessons should departments take from the pandemic going forward?
The big one is that caregiving can't be treated as just a personal matter. Departments need policies that account for the way childcare shocks hit research time and careers. Departments also need to consider who is asked to take on greater teaching and service responsibilities when needs arise. And for graduate students, the pandemic underscored the need to support multiple career pathways and provide steady mentoring and funding. In short, departments should plan now so that the next crisis doesn't deepen inequalities.
Now, let me push back on that assessment. Frankly, caregiving is a personal matter. I understand in the US, there is no legal mandate for employers to accommodate parents. The pandemic hit everyone, not just academics, and some of this sounds like demands for pampering.
I hear that concern, Ryan. Departments aren't responsible for faculty children, but they do have a professional stake in equity and productivity. Managing your human resources and planning for emergencies is not pampering, and it doesn't have to be costly.
I have one final question for you, Emma. If a department wants to do something right now that isn't expensive or disruptive, based on the pandemic research we have discussed, what is the best step?
Departments could do a much better job at communicating existing support policies and plans. During the pandemic, a lot of stress came from people not knowing what help was available, whether that was deadline extensions, mentoring, or even just who to ask for flexibility. Setting up a clear, consistent way to share that information is simple, inexpensive, and can make a real difference.
Thank you so much for sharing your analysis with us, Emma.
You're welcome. And thank you for hosting the podcast and giving me the opportunity to talk about the state of the discipline.
And of course, we thank you, dear listener, for joining us on the Political Science Data Podcast.